sampling and participants come at the point where your study becomes real in a very practical way. By the time you reach this step, you have already clarified the phenomenon, named the tension inside it, explained the consequence of leaving that tension unresolved, and identified the literature gap that shows what is missing. You have chosen a methodology, selected a design, written a purpose statement, and written research questions that match that design. You have also thought through what data you need, and which instruments or sources will produce that data. Sampling comes next because you cannot choose participants until you know what evidence you need and how you plan to collect it. Sampling is the bridge between your questions and your data because it determines whose voices, experiences, or scores will represent the phenomenon you are studying. In research writing, it helps to separate a few key terms that students often blend together. Participants are the people or units you will collect data from. The population is the full group your study is about in theory, the full cast of people your topic points toward. The sample is the smaller group you actually include in practice, the people you can access, recruit, and study. The site is the setting where recruitment and data collection happen. The sampling frame is the accessible pool you are realistically sampling from, which is often narrower than the population. When your population, sampling frame, site, and sample are clearly defined, the reader can immediately understand who the study is meant to speak to and who it actually includes. Sampling is not something you choose based on preference. Sampling is dictated by design because design dictates the kind of evidence you need. Quantitative designs aim for enough participants to run stable analyses and for measurement that allows comparison, prediction, or relationship testing. Qualitative designs prioritize information-rich participants and depth because the goal is meaning and understanding. Mixed methods requires both, plus a plan for how the two strands connect across phases. In other words, your design determines not only what data you collect, but also who you need to collect it from. It is also important to be honest about the reality of dissertation sampling in social and behavioral research. Many dissertations rely on nonprobability sampling because researchers are working in real institutions with access constraints, gatekeepers, schedules, and fixed settings. This does not make a study invalid, but it does shape what claims can be made. The most important move is to align the sampling plan with the design, and then be transparent about limitations. A strong dissertation does not pretend access constraints do not exist. It makes the constraints visible, and then writes claims that match what the sampling method can support. This is where generalizability and transferability come in. Generalizability is primarily a quantitative concern. It refers to how confidently you can apply your findings from the sample to a larger population, and it depends on how representative your sample is and how sampling was conducted. Random sampling strengthens generalizability. Nonprobability sampling limits it. That is why quantitative dissertations should define the population they are actually representing and keep claims proportional to the sampling method. Note that true random sampling hardly ever happens in social and behavioral research. Due to the specific instances being studied, it is unlikely to fit the definition. If you sampled from one district, one program, or one site using convenience access, then your results may still be meaningful and useful, but your claims must reflect that context rather than speaking as if the sample represents every setting everywhere. Qualitative research does not aim for statistical generalizability. Instead, qualitative research aims for transferability. Transferability means your study provides enough detail and depth that readers can determine whether the findings may apply to a similar context. Transferability is supported through purposeful sampling, rich description, and clear contextual boundaries. The goal is not to claim that the findings represent everyone like with random sampling. The goal is to illuminate the phenomenon so clearly and credibly that others can recognize the meaning and decide whether it fits their setting. In mixed methods, you must be clear about both. The quantitative strand has limits based on the sampling approach and how representative the sample is. The qualitative strand supports transferability through depth, context, and purposeful selection. Mixed methods can create a stronger overall understanding, but it still must be honest about what is generalizable and what is transferable. Quantitative sampling in applied dissertation work begins with inclusion and exclusion criteria. Inclusion criteria define who must be included, so the sample matches the research question. Exclusion criteria define who must be left out because their inclusion would distort the meaning of the variables or the phenomenon. Quantitative dissertations also need a sample size that is appropriate for the analysis planned. Even when sampling is not random, the study still must have enough data for correlation, regression, chi-square, t-tests, ANOVA and COVA, or MANCOVA to be stable. Small samples weaken inferential results, reduce statistical power, and increase the risk that real relationships or differences will not be detected. Uneven groups also matter, because group comparisons become less stable when one group is much smaller than the other. In real school and organizational contexts, true random sampling is often unrealistic because access is organized through intact groups. Researchers may recruit by classroom, school, program, or cohort. This is why approaches like cluster sampling and multistage sampling show up in applied settings, because the unit you can access is often a group rather than an individual. Many quantitative dissertations ultimately rely on convenience or available samples, and that can still be acceptable, but it must be written honestly. However, if you are sampling based on criteria, this can overlap purposive sampling. The sampling frame must be clearly defined, the recruitment approach must be clear, and the claims must be proportional to what the sampling method supports. Qualitative sampling is different because the goal is depth, not representativeness. Qualitative sampling is purposeful. You select participants because they can provide rich understanding of the phenomenon, not because they create a statistically representative snapshot. The sampling strategy should match the research question, the qualitative design, who actually has access to the experience, and what kind of meaning you need to capture. Purposive sampling is the umbrella strategy used in almost all qualitative research. It means that you intentionally select participants because they can provide rich, relevant, and meaningful information about the phenomenon. Criterion, maximum variation, homogeneous, typical case, critical case, snowball are types of purposive sampling. Criterion sampling is used when participants must meet specific conditions to be included, such as having experienced a particular program, transition, or policy. In criterion sampling, you select all participants who meet a defined criterion connected to the phenomenon. Maximum variation sampling is used when you want a wide range of experiences, not because you are trying to be statistically representative, but because you want to understand how the phenomenon looks across meaningful differences. Homogeneous sampling is used when you want depth within a very specific group that shares key characteristics, allowing you to examine the experience with intensity and focus, so you select participants who all share the same key characteristic. Typical case sampling is used when you want a picture of the most common version of the experience in a particular setting, so you select participants or settings that represent an average or typical manifestation of the phenomenon. Critical case sampling is used when a particular case is especially illuminating or high impact, making it valuable for understanding the phenomenon, so you select a rare, high impact, or especially meaningful case where the phenomenon is sharply visible. Snowball sampling is used when the group is difficult to reach or not easily identified, and participants help connect you to others who meet the criteria. Convenience sampling can happen when access and time constraints shape recruitment, but it must be acknowledged honestly because it affects what you can claim and what voices may be missing. Selecting participants who are easily accessible is technically purposive when the researcher also requires they meet certain criteria, but must be acknowledged as a limitation. Qualitative sample size is guided by saturation, which is the point where additional data begins to repeat rather than add new insight. Saturation is not about reaching a magic number. It is about reaching depth and completeness of understanding within the bounds of your design. Dissertation feasibility matters too, but qualitative sampling should still be written as a defensible plan for depth rather than a plan based only on what is easiest to recruit. Sampling should also align with qualitative design. In narrative research, you select individuals who have a story that reveals the phenomenon across time and meaning. In phenomenology, You select participants who share the lived experience at the center of the study and can describe its meaning in their own words. In ethnography, you sample within a culture-sharing group and may include multiple roles inside that group because culture is expressed across positions, routines, and norms. In case study, you sample within the bounded case and you often include multiple participant roles, plus documents and artifacts as sampled evidence, because the goal is to understand the case in depth and in context. In grounded theory, sampling becomes theoretical and iterative, meaning participants are selected over time as the emerging explanation develops, which is one reason grounded theory is often difficult to carry out fully within dissertation constraints. Mixed methods sampling must match the mixed design and must explain how participants connect across strands. In explanatory sequential designs, the quantitative sample is typically larger, and the qualitative sample is purposefully selected from it to explain the quantitative results. This often means selecting participants who represent key patterns, such as high scorers, low scorers, or unexpected results, because the qualitative phase is designed to help interpret what the numbers showed. In exploratory sequential designs, the qualitative sample comes first to explore the phenomenon, and then the quantitative sample follows to test, extend, or refine what emerged, sometimes using an instrument built from qualitative findings. In convergent designs, quantitative and qualitative samples may be the same or different, but both must represent the same phenomenon, and the plan must explain how results will be merged or compared. Sampling is not only about people. Researchers also sample documents, artifacts, events, settings, and programs. This is why the unit of analysis matters. If your research question is about individuals, your sampling plan focuses on people. If it is about classrooms, schools, or programs, the sampling plan may involve selecting sites or groups as the unit. If your study relies on documents or artifacts, you must explain which documents count as evidence, why those documents were selected, and how they relate to the phenomenon. When the unit of analysis is unclear, sampling becomes unclear, and when sampling is unclear, results become difficult to interpret. Recruitment is also part of sampling, and recruitment must be ethical. Sampling plans should include informed consent, privacy protections, and steps to minimize coercion. Power dynamics matter when recruiting students, employees, or people in dependent relationships with the researcher. Even when participation is technically voluntary, participants can feel pressure if the researcher holds authority or evaluation power. Ethical recruitment means protecting participants from that pressure, being transparent about what participation involves, and protecting confidentiality. There are a few sampling mistakes that show up repeatedly. One is sampling before clarifying the unit of analysis, which causes the sample to drift away from the question. Another is choosing participants who do not actually experience the phenomenon, which produces shallow or irrelevant data. Another is using vague inclusion criteria, which makes the study feel unbounded and unclear. Another is underestimating sample needs for quantitative analysis, which weakens inferential conclusions. Another is over-recruiting qualitative participants without a plan for depth, which creates overwhelming data that cannot be analyzed well. Another is relying on convenience without acknowledging its effect on claims. Another is failing to explain how mixed methods samples connect across phases, which makes the design feel disconnected. The correction is always the same. Return to alignment. Let the question tell you who needs to be included. Let the design tell you how to select them, and let your claims match what your sampling strategy can support. Sampling is alignment in human form. If the sample does not match the question and design, the study cannot answer what it claims. When sampling is aligned, the data has credibility, the results have integrity, and the study becomes defensible and feasible.